Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Mary Angela Saavedra. I'm the director of the Center on the Hill. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to the Forum on the Hill. Thank you so much for coming out in questionable weather circumstances. It's cold, it's hot, it's cold, it's hot. I wish it would make up its mind. But thank you all so much for being here today. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Josh Hitchens was born and raised in Sussex County, Delaware. He's been a storyteller for the Ghost Tour of Philadelphia since 2007. His first book, Haunted History of Delaware, was released in 2021 by Arcadia Publishing. Josh has also written articles for Philadelphia Weekly and the Broad Street Review. You can find him online at joshhitchens.com. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you now, Josh Hitchens.
Good afternoon, folks. It is such a pleasure to be here today. Nice to meet all of you. So today I'm going to be reading a bit from my second book, which is Haunted History of Philadelphia. I'm going to read a selection from the introduction to the book, and then I'm going to read a full chapter of it for all of you. The introduction will tell you a little bit about who I am and the kind of book this is. After I finish reading, if you have any questions for me about the writing process, about anything about haunted Philadelphia history, I'd be delighted to answer your questions as well. So this is a little bit from the introduction, which is called The Darker Side of Philadelphia. I think I have a right to call myself a Philadelphian, though I am not sure if Philadelphia is of the same opinion. Those words begin the 1914 book, Our Philadelphia, written by Elizabeth Robbins Pennell, a journalist and author who was born and raised in Philadelphia, but spent most of her life in England. I identify with her statement deeply. I was born and spent the first 18 years of my life in Sussex County, Delaware, then moved to Philadelphia to attend college at Arcadia University, which is also very haunted, as you'll see if you get to read the whole book. There is a chapter all about that. Now, I fell head over heels in love with this richly historic, strange, miraculous, endlessly fascinating city, and I've never left. As of this writing, I have lived in Philadelphia for over half my life, nearly 20 years. But I am always conscious that compared to those who were born and raised in this uniquely American place, I will always be a humble visitor. My name is Josh Hitchens, and I tell ghost stories for a living. In my introduction to my first book, published by the History Press, Haunted History of Delaware, I go into detail about how my passion for history, ghost stories, and folklore began. There are countless connections between Philadelphia and the state of Delaware in the historical record. Their shared destinies are, in many ways, inextricably intertwined. Since my grandparents took me on my very first ghost tour in Colonial Williamsburg when I was 8 years old, I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, and here we are. In 2007, when I graduated from Arcadia University, the first job I applied for was to be a storyteller for the Ghost Tour of Philadelphia, one of the oldest continuously operating ghost tours in the United States. It was established in 1995 by Eileen and Tim Reeser, and I take great pride in saying at the beginning of my ghost tour in Philadelphia that I am not a paranormal investigator. I am a storyteller. And I believe there is a great power in that, of knowing that you are part of a chain that goes back through the ages, all the way back to when we learned to talk and sit around a fire together, telling stories to one another in the dark. And ghost stories are always the best. When you feel truly afraid, you know you're alive. That moment when you were truly deeply frightened can burn itself into your memory forever. And years later, you can recall every sensory detail, and you get that chill again, and you shiver. That is what a ghost story can do, if the telling is good. For me, the receiving and the passing on of local tales and legends is one of the best and most enjoyable gateways into the hidden riches of local history, no matter where you live. The history of Philadelphia does not begin with William Penn in 1682, despite what many books and tour guides would have you believe. It actually begins thousands of years earlier, when the land that we now call Pennsylvania was home to the Lenni Lenape Native American people. Their territory also included what is now known as the states of Delaware, New Jersey, and New York. Shelley DePaul, the administrative and education chief of the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, was interviewed about the history of her people in the first episode of the 13-part documentary series Philadelphia, the Great Experiment, which you can watch for free on YouTube, courtesy of History Making Productions. She said, "The Lenape are the original people on this land. Archaeological evidence shows that they've been here for 13,000 years. The river was the lifeblood of the land. It's sacred to our people. In our society, the women were the ones to make the important decisions. They were the ones to appoint the chiefs. Women were the holders of all property. It was very important to them to maintain a balance. They were very much aware of balance in all nature. The other tribes found strength by forming this huge confederacy, but the Lenape were not interested in doing that. They were not a warlike tribe. Their strength was in their peacefulness, but they were certainly fierce enough warriors when they had to be." Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation historian, the Reverend John Norwood, said, "Our people were numerous at one point. Early explorers talk about our campfires being so plentiful that they lit the sky at night." The first European settlers began to arrive in 1609. First the Dutch, followed in 1638 by the Swedes, who created the colony of New Sweden. Philadelphia still honors its Swedish roots with the blue and yellow colors of its flag. The European colonists also brought with them infectious and deadly diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and malaria, all of which devastated the Lenni Lenape population of the region. Norwood says, "A chief told a missionary that for every one of you that arrives here on a boat, 10 of us die." There are stories of there not even being enough people left in the villages to bury the dead. Some of the diseases attack the oldest and the youngest. So the ones who were the keepers of the wisdom and the ones who had the strength to perpetuate the community were wiped out. Historians estimate that European diseases killed approximately 75% of the region's Native American population. In letters, William Penn wrote that he intended the city of Philadelphia to be a holy experiment, the seed of a nation, where people of all kinds could live freely together without fear of persecution, a green country town that would be unlike any other city in the world. A contrast with the confusingly winding streets of London, he laid out Philadelphia on a grid pattern, the model of which is still being followed centuries later. Because Penn had lived through the nightmare of the Great Fire of London in 1666, he also decreed that buildings be constructed of brick or stone and not wood, and placed 5 open squares of land throughout the city to make it difficult for a catastrophic fire to occur. And unlike the brutal justice system of England, William Penn envisioned a system that was fairer and less harsh. Initially, the city of Philadelphia operated very much as William Penn had intended, but the purity of his mission could not last forever. Philadelphia, more than any other American city, has always struggled with its split personality, writes author Thomas H. Keels in his book, Wicked Philadelphia. That's an excellent book, by the way, you should check it out. Jennifer L. Green also writes of this unique duality in her book, Dark History of Penn's Woods. Beneath the golden mantle of utopia, however, seethed an underbelly of dissent, frustration, and violence. As early as 1693, the provincial council complained that Pennsylvanians were already violating Penn's proclamations against Sabbath breaking, drunkenness, idleness, unlawful gaming, and all manner of profaneness. The looseness of the laws of Pennsylvania also encouraged settlers to break them even more frequently. And in hindsight, we can understand why diverse groups of immigrants from Germany, Ireland, and Scotland might not want to embrace the Quaker strictures against gambling, dancing, fancy dress, and theater. Stayedness is not everyone's cup of tea. From its inception, there have been strange shadows underneath Philadelphia's history that have almost never found their way into the official history books. On the one hand, there is the accepted narrative of the founding fathers and mothers of the nation and all of their great works. But on the other hand, there is a much darker side to the city of brotherly love that has rarely been given a voice, and that is why I wrote this book. William Penn himself presided over the first and the only witchcraft trial to occur in Pennsylvania, although witchcraft was not actually a crime until 1718. But in 1683, in what is now known as Chester County, 2 women were accused of being witches. Like many women in Europe before them, and the men and women in Salem, Massachusetts after them, they were regarded as outsiders by their neighbors. Both women were older. Neither one of them spoke English. Margaret Matson and Yeshro Hendrickson, both immigrants from Sweden, were accused of bewitching their neighbors' cows to stop them from giving milk, killing other livestock, and appearing at night in spectral form, threatening their victims with a large knife. 2 of Margaret Matson's accusers were her daughter and her son-in-law, who may have been interested in obtaining the huge tract of Ridley Creek farmland their mother owned. Eager not to follow Europe's example of executing scores of women for witchcraft with flimsy evidence, William Penn went to great lengths to ensure a fair trial. He allowed Margaret Matson to defend herself, highly unusual in the 17th century. He hired a court interpreter as well to overcome the language barrier. Penn himself asked questions of Margaret Matson and the witnesses who accused her in front of a 12-man jury. The court records that we have left today suggest that Yeshro Hendrickson was perhaps not present at the trial, as no testimony attributed to her survives. Margaret Matson denied all the charges against her, saying, "These witnesses speak only by hearsay. I deny these accusations at my very soul. Where is my daughter? Let her come here and say so." There is one anecdote about this trial that is not found in the historical records that survive. Legend says that when William Penn asked Margaret Matson if she had ever flown through the air on a broomstick, as her accusers alleged, and perhaps due to a mistake by the court interpreter, Margaret Matson answered that question by saying yes. The court erupted in gasps, and William Penn considered for a very long moment and then said correctly that there was no law on the books preventing people from riding through the air on broomsticks. Finally, the jury reached its verdict. Margaret Matson and Yeshro Hendrickson were found guilty of having the common fame of a witch, but not guilty in the form and matter indicted. In other words, they were guilty of being thought to be witches, but they were not actually witches. Margaret Matson and Yeshro Hendrickson were ordered to pay a fine and were sent back to their homes. The men and women who were accused of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, just 9 years later, would not be so fortunate. Another famous Philadelphian that historical records show may have been a witch might surprise you: Betsy Ross. Born Elizabeth Griscom in 1752 and glorified in American legend as the woman who sewed the first stars and stripes for George Washington. It is almost certain she did not, But the real Betsy Ross is worth celebrating as an independent woman who persevered and ran her own business successfully, a business that was based entirely on her own expertise and skill. And she faced immense obstacles, but overcame them. And one of those obstacles was being widowed thrice. One of Betsy's descendants, Lee Griscom, wrote in a 1945 letter, "It is said she had the gift of healing, which she practiced secretly for fear of gaining the reputation of being a witch. She also had a remarkable gift for foreseeing events." In her definitive biography, Betsy Ross and the Making of America, Marla R. Miller relates another supernatural incident passed down through time. If the affidavits are to be believed, Betsy Ross planted the seeds of her own mythology in the 1820s and 1830s as she regaled her children and her grandchildren with stories of her youth, her work and life in revolutionary Philadelphia. And she laughed as she recounted a dream she had had in her youth in which she saw the letters G-R-A-C appear in the sky. Her friends then teased her that she was missing the E to spell the word grace. But Betsy replied that she had that in her first name, Elizabeth, and then happily explained to her listeners the dream's true meaning, how she could not have known then what she would in time, that the letters she saw in the sky were the various initials of the various names she took with her 3 marriages, Elizabeth Griscom Ross Ashburn Claypool. Today, the Betsy Ross house is one of the most popular tourist destinations in Philadelphia, although it is uncertain if she ever actually lived in that particular house. The bones of Betsy and her third husband, John Claypool, were reinterred there in 1975 from Mount Moriah Cemetery in West Philadelphia, although whether the remains are truly those of Betsy and John is also somewhat controversial. An article from the Associated Press reported, "When anthropologist Dr. Alan Mann and 2 grave diggers excavated the site under which Mrs. Ross was supposed to be buried, they found nothing. They finally discovered a decayed coffin several feet away from where Mrs. Ross was supposed to have been. Through the caved-in lid, they spotted bones." Mann cautioned that although he will probably be able to tell if the skeleton is a woman, he may not be able to tell if it was Betsy Ross or one of the other women, her daughter and her granddaughter, who were supposed to be buried nearby. Nevertheless, bones attributed to Betsy Ross and John Claypool are buried in the courtyard of what is now called the Betsy Ross house. Many visitors to the Betsy Ross house over the years have reported seeing her ghost on the property in what is believed to have been her bedroom, kneeling by the bed as if in prayer or deep sorrow. In the basement of the house, staff and visitors have heard a woman's voice saying, pardon me," when there is no one there to pardon. So that's a little bit from the introduction, and now I'm going to read what is the last chapter in the book, but was actually the very first chapter that I wrote. And weirdly, for my first book, Haunted History of Delaware, the same thing happened. The chapter I wrote first ended up being the last one. This chapter is called The Madness of Mary Lum Gerard. While the city of Philadelphia may honor Stephen Gerard, the founder of Gerard College and the primary financier of the War of 1812, not much is known about his wife, Mary Lum Gerard. Who was Mary Lum? And why has her name been undersold in a city that purports to honor its historic figures? A clue can be found on the first floor of Pennsylvania Hospital. A large plaque honoring Stephen Gerard's contributions to the hospital also mentions that his wife, Mary Lum, lies buried somewhere near this spot. If Mary Lum is buried somewhere on the grounds of the hospital, where is she? And why isn't her grave noted? Tom Nichols, Philadelphia Free Press. Mary Lum was born in Philadelphia in the year 1758. She was the daughter of a shipbuilder and was described by her contemporaries as very beautiful with long, flowing black hair. As was true for many women of her time, any words that Mary herself may have written about her life have not survived. There are no letters, there are no diaries. No one who knew her ever recorded a single word that she said, as far as we know. She has become a mostly tragic, forgotten footnote in American history. When Mary Lum is remembered at all, it is chiefly because she was the wife of Stephen Gerard, the millionaire who left an indelible mark on the city of Philadelphia. Mary Lum is also remembered today for a darker reason: her insanity and her restless ghost. 18 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, Mary Lum had another reason to cherish that memorable year. In 1776, in the whirlwind of revolution of Philadelphia, Mary Lum met and fell in love with a newly arrived 26-year-old French grocery store owner named Stephen Gerard. In 1777, she married him. Born in Bordeaux as the son of an ordinary sailor in 1750, Stephen Gerard became blind in his right eye when he was 8 years old. He arrived in Philadelphia in 1776 and quickly became a successful businessman. Eventually, his fortune became immense. When he died, he was the richest man in the nation. And according to one study that was done in 1996, adjusting for inflation, Stephen Gerard was still the fourth richest person to ever live in the United States, behind John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and John Jacob Astor. After their wedding in 1777, Mary Lum and Stephen Gerard apparently had a happy married life for 8 years. However, in 1785, it began to be whispered among Philadelphia's elite circle that Mary Gerard had become insane. She was 27 years old. It was reported that Mary began to become emotionally unstable, often having uncontrollable and sometimes violent outbursts of deep rage or extreme sadness. Stephen Gerard wrote in a letter to his brother, "If it is not a physical ailment, it is of the mind. The illness of this virtuous woman has so unsettled my life." As Mary's mental illness progressed, Stephen wrote of her sickness and her derangements. Some records say that Mary was often found walking through the streets in her nightgown. It is not recorded what caused Mary Lum's descent into the private hell of mental illness, but after 2 years, Stephen Gerard had had enough of his wife's madness. In 1787, he took a mistress, beginning a sexual relationship with a younger woman named Sally Bickham. Considering his marriage to be effectively over, Stephen Gerard then moved Sally Bickham into his house while Mary was still living there. Mary's thoughts and feelings about these events are not known, but it is easy to imagine that being forced to live with her husband's much younger girlfriend would have had a negative effect on her state of mind. In The Life and Times of Stephen Gerard, author John Bach McMaster writes of this time. A consultation of eminent physicians was called, who were unanimous in the belief that the sole hope for the restoration of her sanity lay in her immediate removal to a hospital. The only hospital in Philadelphia at present which received such patients was Pennsylvania Hospital at 8th and Spruce Streets. On August 31st, 1790, Stephen Gerard had Mary Lum committed to Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia as a, quote, incurable lunatic. She was 32 years old, and according to her husband and others, had been insane for 5 years at the time of her confinement. The person responsible for forcibly committing Mary Lum Gerard to Pennsylvania Hospital was, somewhat ironically, none other than Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Dr. Rush himself described the insane patients' rooms at Pennsylvania Hospital as cold and damp in the winter, hot in the summer, lacking ventilation, stuffy, and malodorous. Mary Lum Gerard was assigned a, quote, spacious room on the first floor of Pennsylvania Hospital and was permitted to walk the hospital's grounds with limited supervision. Unlike most other mental patients at the hospital, she was allowed to receive visitors with few restrictions. It is unknown if Stephen Gerard ever came to visit her, or if anyone ever did. Shortly after Mary was confined to Pennsylvania Hospital, she gave birth to a baby girl who she named after herself. Her child died at 5 months old, and although we do not know, it is almost certain that the death of her baby plunged her further into grief. Stephen Gerard never had any children with any of his various mistresses, suggesting to some historians he may have been infertile. The father of Mary's child was likely another man. It is possible to imagine that after her husband moved his mistress, Sally Bickham, into the house, that Mary may have taken a lover of her own. There are unverified rumors handed down through time that the father of Mary Lum's child was black. For the racist, slave-owning Stephen Gerard, this may have been the last straw. Perhaps that is the real reason why Mary was committed to Pennsylvania Hospital in 1790. But we cannot know for sure. But in 1787, Stephen Gerard did write these words in a letter to his brother. Having been so foolish as to marry this unfortunate vixen, I treat her properly, but at the same time, I despise her as much as it is possible to despise anyone. I hate her like the devil, and note with pleasure that this feeling increases from day to day. Stephen Gerard was a rich and powerful man in Philadelphia. No one asked any questions. Mary Lum Gerard never left Pennsylvania Hospital. She remained in prison there for 25 years, dying on September 15th, 1815. She was 56 years old when she died. Her cause of death was not recorded. Stephen Gerard ordered Mary's body to be laid to rest on the grounds of Pennsylvania Hospital in an unmarked grave on the northern lawn. A man named Professor William Wagner was present at the funeral for Mary Lum Gerard, and he later recalled, towards the close of the day, after the sun had withdrawn its last beams from the tallest sycamore which shades the garden, Mr. Gerard was sent for, and when he arrived with all his family, the plain coffin of Mary Gerard was carried forward to her resting place in the deepest silence. I shall never forget the last and closing scene. We all stood about the coffin as Mr. Gerard, filled with emotion, stepped forward, kissed his wife's corpse, and his tears moistened her cheek. Following a hush of a few minutes' duration, the coffin was lowered into the grave, and another silence ensued, after which Gerard bent over and bestowed a last look upon his dead wife, and then, turning from the newly made grave, said to the gravedigger Samuel Coates, "It is very well," and he returned immediately to his home. This all sounds quite sadly romantic, but it is important to remember the detail Wagner gives in his first sentence. Mary Lum Gerard's funeral took place after the sun had set in darkness, so no passerby could see. She was hidden away from the world to the very end. We cannot know for sure what Mary thought or felt in the final years of her life. Her lived human experience has been lost to time, and her true voice remains elusive and silent. Or perhaps not entirely silent. From soon after her death up until the present day, stories have circulated throughout Philadelphia of Mary Lum Gerard's ghost haunting Pennsylvania Hospital. Patients housed in the room where she died often reported waking up in the middle of the night to see a strange woman standing at the foot of their bed before suddenly vanishing. The apparition of a woman in a white dress has been seen walking on the grounds of Pennsylvania Hospital at night, often disappearing on the north lawn, near the site where Mary Lum Gerard's grave is located. No paintings or sketchings of Mary Gerard have survived, so it is impossible to know for sure if the ghost that so many people have seen is her. But in the vicinity of Mary's old room on the first floor, sounds of a woman crying inconsolably are often heard, and upon investigation, there is no one there. What of Stephen Gerard himself? He died on December 26, 1831, at the age of 81, 16 years after the death of Mary. The wealthiest man in the United States at the time of his death, Stephen Gerard was buried in the Catholic Cemetery of Holy Trinity Church, despite being an atheist all his life. The church was, and still is, located at 6th and Spruce Streets, just 2 blocks away from Mary's unmarked grave at Pennsylvania Hospital. 20 years after his burial, the remains of Stephen Gerard were exhumed and reinterred in a tomb built in the Founders Hall vestibule of Gerard College across town. Ever since his remains were moved, people walking past the cemetery gates of Holy Trinity Church at night have been startled to see the figure of an old man standing in the cemetery, looking down at the ground, who then mysteriously vanishes. Does the ghost of Stephen Gerard haunt the earth because his bones were moved? Or does he remain out of guilt or as a punishment for what he did to his wife, Mary Lum, whose sorrowful ghost haunts the hospital just 2 blocks away? On July 4th, 1976, Laney Robertson's powerful one-act play, The Insanity of Mary Gerard, premiered in Philadelphia. Concord Theatricals describes the play like this. In 1790, Mary Gerard is committed to an asylum. After Mary became pregnant by another man, her husband had her declared legally insane. Now Mary sits in a chair as the Furies dance around her, impersonating people from her past. By the end of this haunting and highly theatrical piece, she has grown rather convincingly into her diagnosis. The play, described by the Times-Picayune newspaper as an engrossing drama on the abuse of the mentally ill, continues to be performed all over the world, raising awareness of Mary Lum Gerard's important and harrowing story. One of the most recent productions of The Insanity of Mary Gerard was an immersive staging at Allen's Lane Theater in Philadelphia as part of the 2019 Fringe Festival, directed with imagination and incisive fury by Mariangela Saavedra. A reporter by the name of Tom Nichols wrote an article for the Philadelphia Free Press with the title, "Is Pennsylvania Hospital Hiding the Shame of Mary Gerard?" In this article, Nichols recounts meeting 3 veterans of World War II named Joe Vendetti, Charlie Roseman, and Bob Ross. The latter 2 graduated from Gerard College in 1939. Vendetti said, "When these 2 guys and I would get together, they talked about their college days. When I retired in 1973, I took up research about Stephen Gerard, and I thought, oh my God, Stephen Gerard's wife has been forgotten and ignored. It particularly distressed them that her grave remained unmarked. So they pooled their money and had a tombstone made to mark the location of Mary's remains. Finally, Mary Lum Gerard would have the memorial she deserved, and perhaps her troubled soul would now cease to walk the hallways and lawns. They donated the headstone to Pennsylvania Hospital. Pennsylvania Hospital refused to accept it. Tom Nichols concludes his article with the words, "A shadow of embarrassment and shame seemed to cover Mary Lum's legacy, proving that the stigma of mental illness, while far worse in the 19th century, still carried considerable weight in modern times. Perhaps, one day, the grave of Mary Lum Gerard will finally be marked, and her spirit will rest in peace. Until then, it is important that the tragic story of her life and her struggle with the demons inside of her mind be remembered, not forgotten in the crumbling pages of old histories, not buried in the darkness, but brought back up again, at last, into the light, forever." Thank you all very much. All right. If anyone has any questions, happy to answer them. Yes, Marianne.
I'll start. So I'm really curious. So you were a storyteller for the Ghost Tour of Philadelphia. So is that what led you to want to write some of these stories down, or like what attracted you to what stories you included, and what was the genesis of that?
That's a great question. So from the time I was very, very little, I have always, from ever since I can remember, been very interested in history, but also in ghost stories and folklore. And as I was a child growing up, went to ghost tours around the country with my family, but I also collected a lot of books of ghost stories from different parts of the country and around the world, and always loved reading them and through the ghost stories, learning about the history of different places. So doing the Ghost Tour of Philadelphia, which I'm still doing, been doing it for 15 years, I feel it's a great honor and a great responsibility to tell those stories, because we all know the stories of the famous people of Philadelphia, right? Like Ben Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, and all Jefferson, and all those folks, and Betsy Ross too. But there are so many people who, if it weren't for stories about their hauntings or folklore about that, would be forgotten. And Mary Lum Gerard is one of those people. So that's one of the reasons why I think that work is so important, and it's a great honor to tell their stories. And getting the stories together for this book, I wanted to have a good selection of different kinds of places. I didn't want it to be all old haunted houses, and I didn't want it to be just focused in Old City either. I wanted it to be both diverse in type of location and also geographic location throughout the city as well. So there's about half of the stories in the book are surrounded in Old City, but there's also places like Eastern State Penitentiary and Fairmount, what used to be known as the General Wayne Inn out in Marion Station, and the Baleroy Mansion in Chestnut, what was known as the Baleroy Mansion in Chestnut Hill as well. So I wanted it to be as full a picture of this place and the stories that I could possibly do. There are so many more stories than I was able to fit into the book. There's 12 chapters. And I actually had to ask my editor as I was writing it, like, what is the maximum amount of words I can have in this book? Because as I was writing, because there's so much history, there's so much richness, I had to really be conscious of keeping within that limit. There are actually 2 chapters that I plan to include in this book that I didn't have room for, but hopefully there'll be another book someday, because there's plenty of material for it. Yes?
Do we know where that tombstone is that was rejected?
Yeah, so she asked, do we know where the tombstone of Mary Lum Gerard is that the gentleman donated? To my knowledge, no. It might still be in their possession. I would probably imagine. I don't think that's something that they would have gotten rid of. But yeah, it's still not a Pennsylvania hospital where it should be, unfortunately. Yes?
Have you experienced being in a place, or let me ask, when was the first time you were at a place where you felt that there was a haunting?
great question. So she asked, when was the first time I was in a place where, I felt like I was in the presence of a haunting? I actually grew up in a haunted house. It wasn't a house where, it wasn't like evil or scary things. It was mostly just feeling a presence, sometimes seeing like shadowy figures of people, particularly on the staircase in my house. And my parents built the house I grew up in, so it wasn't like some old creepy haunted mansion as cool as that would have been to grow up in. So I always felt that whatever was in that house, it was related to the land that the house stood on. So that's always been a piece of my life, and I am sensitive to that kind of stuff, and I have seen ghosts at many different places throughout my life, a lot of places in Philadelphia, all of which I describe in the book as well. But sometimes, I've seen things sometimes, but most of the time, it's just a feeling. Like even doing the ghost tour, like walking up to say the Bishop White House in Old City in the garden, and just like walking up there and be like, ooh, there's something here, and I'm just sort of saying in my mind, I'm just doing my job. I'm going to tell this story, and then I will leave you alone. I've really very rarely been frightened by it, but it's something that I'm always aware of. Yeah.
Is the mansion from Chestnut Hill, is that still standing?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not familiar with it.
Sure thing, I'll talk a little bit about it. That's actually one of my favorite chapters in the book. So the Valerie Mansion is still standing. It's located on West Mermaid Lane. And it was owned for many years by the Easby family, in particular a man named George Gordon Meade Easby, who is a descendant of General Meade, fought in the Civil War. And that house is really interesting because during the time the Easbys lived there, pretty much every kind of paranormal thing you could imagine happened. They saw ghosts of family members, objects would move, and he also had a lot of antiques. Like he had a clock that was owned by Marie Antoinette, and the silverware that the signers used in the dinner after they signed the Declaration of Independence. So it had just these amazing objects, which also brought a lot of spirits into the home. And he died, I want to say in 2005. And he's buried in Laurel Hill Cemetery along with his ancestor. But after that, the Baleroy Mansion was sold to another family, so it's now a private residence. You can't go walking up to it and probably call the cops. And all the furniture that George Meade Easby owned was sold to different places. So all the interior of the house is very different. And I talk about this in the book, but the new family that moved in, they were Catholic, and they said in a newspaper article that, it's tradition to have a priest come and bless your house, even if it's not a haunted house. And they said, but we did tell the priest to take his time while he was doing it. But yeah, the Baleroy Mansion is really fascinating. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned that Stephen Gerard was a grocer. Are there other ways that he made his fortune?
That's a great question. So Stephen Gerard, when he first came to Philadelphia, started out as a grocer, but he also very quickly got involved in the shipping business, and that's really where he made the bulk of his fortune. And then, of course, as he got richer and richer, diversified into many different areas of business, as a lot of the other richest folks in America have done. Start small in one thing and then keep building and building and building. As you get richer and richer and richer, to continue to get richer and richer and richer. Yeah.
When is the walking tour downtown?
Great question. So I work for the Ghost Tour Philadelphia, which again, their website is easy to remember. It is ghosttour.com. And the Ghost Tour runs every night at 7:30 p.m. And it starts in the Signers Garden, which is right at 5th and Chestnut Streets. I don't do it every night, but we have a staff of about 12 different storytellers that do the tour, and they are all excellent. So if you ever decide to take the ghost tour, you might get me, or you might get one of the other amazing storytellers. And it's usually about an hour and 15 minutes, and the walk is just a little under a mile. But it's a lot of fun. It is.
Can you briefly tell us the story behind the General Wayne Inn?
Sure. So the General Wayne Inn, which is still standing today, but it is now a Jewish community center. The Shabbat on the Main Line is what it's called. So it dates back to the 1700s. Ben Franklin used it as a post office for a time and ran it there. But it was historically an inn because it was located right on the road between Philadelphia and Lancaster. So it was a heavily trafficked road. So it was also active during the American Revolution. George Washington stayed there for a night, and General Anthony Wayne also stayed there during the war. General Anthony Wayne was called, he had a nickname, Mad Anthony Wayne, because in battle he would take these huge risks that people would be like, what are you doing? Sometimes they would pay off, sometimes they wouldn't, but he sort of had a reputation for this fearlessness. And after the revolution, there were also a lot of German or Hessian soldiers who were around during the battle, and they were German mercenaries fighting on the side of the British. And the earliest ghost story about the General Wayne Inn happened in, I want to say the 1830s, because it was being used as a polling place during an election. And a woman went down to the basement to go get more ballots. And she saw a soldier in a German Revolutionary War uniform down in the basement. And that was actually recorded in the report they made to the Board of Elections. So that is totally verified. And the ghost of this Hessian soldier was seen at the General Wayne Inn for many years. Up until about the 1990s, people saw him. But the General Wayne Inn is interesting because they would also have what is called poltergeist activity, things like glasses would start rattling, chandelier would start swinging when there's no breeze, doors would open and close by themselves. Patrons at the General Wayne Inn would be sitting at the bar and would feel someone blow on the back of their neck and look, and there's no one there. And this would happen over a period of time to everyone who was sitting on the bar. So there's a lot of really fun stories about that. A not so fun thing about the General Wayne Inn is that, and the reason why it closed is that there was a murder that happened there, and the gentleman killed his business partner there, and he was convicted. He is serving life in prison, but that's what led to it being closed. And it was for so long one of the oldest continuously operating inns in the United States. But then, fell into a state of abandonment, and that's when this Jewish community center took it over, and it is regarded as one of the best Jewish community centers in the state of Pennsylvania. But there was a newspaper article at the time when they took it over. They did an interview with a rabbi, and they asked him about, how do you feel about, this place being so haunted and that reputation? And the rabbi said, with a mezuzah on every door, the ghost will be, going out the door, and if not, they will convert them and count them in the minyan, is what the rabbi said, which I love that. So that's briefly the General Wayne Inn. Any other questions? Yes, back there.
I just wanted to know, where does the tour take place each evening?
Great. So the Ghost Tour Philadelphia, it's confined to Old City and Society Hill. So the usual route starts at 5th and Chestnut, goes to Independence Hall, Washington Square, which is just south of Independence Hall, and then it goes into Society Hill to places such as the graveyard of St. Peter's Church on Pine Street, the Bishop White House at 3rd and Walnut, and usually ends at the City Tavern, yes, which is sadly closed at the moment because of the pandemic, but I hope they open once again. Oh, I saw some other hands. Yes?
I got one good final question for you. Do you anticipate wanting to write for a different city? Like, do you foresee that, like, sometime in the future you might want to? Is there another city on your radar, some other part of the country that you might want to dive into?
Yeah, so there are definitely like other cities that, of course, have such rich history and such rich ghost stories and folklore. The publisher that has done my first 2 books, this one and Haunted History of Delaware, their thing is they really want authors who are connected to that community, who live there or have lived there, so I wouldn't necessarily be able to do like, for instance, like a book about New Orleans for them, but there's lots of other publishers out there. And I have a podcast called Going Dark Theater, where I talk about ghost stories from all over the world and unsolved mysteries and just sort of weird historical incidents. And something I'm thinking about is starting to pull the text from that podcast together and maybe make a book about that, perhaps self-publishing on Amazon. I've had some friends who have done that. I've been very happy with it. So that might be something on the horizon. Yes?
What's the story of Arcadia University?
Great, yeah, I'll talk about that briefly. So Arcadia University is in Glenside, was originally known as Beaver College, as some of you may know. Became Arcadia in 2001. I started there in 2003. The stories about Arcadia University, I would really put under the label of like urban legends, in that like there is little like historical evidence in the record for their validity, but there have been a lot of things that have been experienced there over the years, including some things I experienced when I was there. But a lot of the legends about Arcadia center on the castle that is on the campus, which is called Grey Towers Castle, which is an amazing and beautiful one. It was built by a man named William Welsh Harrison, and the legends go that William Welsh Harrison and his wife Bertha did not get along, so they lived in separate wings of the castle. There's stories about William Harrison having affairs with like the maidservants, and there's a story that one day Mrs. Harrison couldn't stand it any longer, so she cornered one of the maids in a room and stabbed her to death, and the room was painted white and the blood was all over the walls. And then when they tried to repaint the room white, the blood stains would keep reappearing. So eventually they painted the room red, and it's called the Red Room. And the walls are still painted red today. They're actually part of the financial aid offices when I worked there. And people would always feel uneasy in that room. They feel like, someone's looking, like watching them looking over their shoulder, things like that. There's also a story about a little girl in the castle who was running down the staircase. It was wintertime. She was wearing a scarf. The scarf got caught on the banister, flipped her over, and broke her neck. And people have seen the ghost of a little girl on that main staircase. And there are stories about because the upper floors are now used for student housing. I never got to live there, very bitter about it. But there are stories about students, running down the stairs, says, "Oh my God, I'm late to class," and they'll feel something like pull back on them, like slow down, So those are a couple of the stories about Arcadia. It's a cool place.
Thank you so much, Josh, for being here. This was really, really wonderful. Please give a round of applause to Josh. Thank you so much. I have a couple copies of his book in the back that I purchased off of Amazon. So if you're interested in one, you can see me. They're $20. I've got 4 of them, and I'm sure people wouldn't mind signing it for you.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if you want to pick one up, please grab one. Also, please feel free to take some refreshments home with you. And come back next month. We have Jane Golden from Mural Arts Philadelphia that will be with us. So thank you so much again. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.